Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Scylla Avdil, and I'm the Executive Director of New Mexico Open Elections. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization based out of the state of New Mexico, and we advocate for issue-related pro-democracy reforms. And we're going to talk about some of them today. But welcome to Strengthening Democracy, the Town Hall series that we started last year. And I'm really proud and honored to be continuing it this year, where we every month host a virtual town hall series, and we highlight local and national experts in the fields of pro-democracy, good government reforms that we are working on. And today's topic is independent voters, locally and nationally. We have Jeremy Groomer, the Senior Vice President of Open Primaries with us, as well as Tyler Fisher, the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships for Unite America. I'll go a little slow as I see more people trickle in. But again, welcome to everyone who's just recently joined. Today's topic is going to be about the rising number of independent voters nationally, but also in the state of New Mexico. There has been a recent report done by Unite America, and so that's why we have one of the authors of this report here with us today, Tyler Fisher, as well as a national expert and advocate for open primaries. We have Jeremy Gruber. And yeah, so recently I want to give a little introduction about the issue. Recently, this report was conducted by Unite America, looking at independent voters and the increase of independent voters, and what does that mean for our country, right? And for every state that we're here from, and focusing on New Mexico today. But also another national effort that has been launched is called Let Us Vote, which we will talk about later. But I wanted to show you guys this video to get you guys to think about and understand why we're talking about independent voters today. The mission and goal of Let Us Vote is to humanize independent voters. And again, we'll get into why we want to humanize them. But yeah, Perry, would you mind showing us the video?
All right, just a moment.
Anytime that you ask me about a position, I'm gonna have to start it with an asterisk and be like, disclaimer, this is based on like my best knowledge at the moment and what I've been exposed to so far. One thing I would say that that should characterize like an independent person is that sort of attitude to say like, this is kind of where I believe right now with what I know, but my mind is always subject to change. I feel like once you give your allegiance to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, questions stop. And to me, like I never want to be in a box where I'm like, all right, I'm strongly, like, let's say fiscally conservative. Okay, that's where I am right now, but I always want to have that freedom to change my mind and my stance with more information and evidence.
I shouldn't have to join your party to be able to participate in democracy. That's what I have to say. Because your party does not represent my values, and you prove that time and time again. So why should I have to join your party to be able to? I mean, I might still even vote for you, but I don't want to join your club.
I am independent because I have a mind of my own. I don't need anyone to tell me that I have to think either A or B. And that's it. And I think it's an insult for independents not to be able to vote in the primary.
So yes, keep your eye out for a series of videos soon to be launched from the state of New Mexico, which we'll get into later. But again, reintroducing our speakers of the day, we have Tyler Fisher, the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships with Unite America, as well as Jeremy Gruber, the Senior Vice President of Open Primaries USA. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And I guess we'll kickstart our conversation of the evening. Tyler, we'll start with you. Why did Unite America decide to create this report?
Thank you for having me, Scylla. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with your supporters this evening. Why did we ask ourselves these questions about independent voters? First, Americans are very frustrated with our political system. I don't think I need to tell this group that. It's an incredibly important year for our democracy, and voters are tuning in. And importantly, they're looking for solutions because they're looking all around them and being very frustrated. But before they come to conclusions on what solutions they want to support, they have to come to understand what the various problematic forces are at play. And at Unite America, we believe it's a fundamental problem and injustice that 23.5 million Americans across 22 states, including New Mexico, cannot participate in taxpayer-funded primary elections that decide the vast majority of our election outcomes. Second, there's a real lack of understanding about who independent voters are and what they believe. National media and researchers often posit that independent voters are simply leaners who just lean one way or the other. But if you ask independent voters what they are and who they believe, they never use the term leaners. And there's as many independent voters in this country as there are Democrats and Republicans combined. So it's truly baffling that we don't have enough research to understand who are these people from a demographic perspective and what do they actually believe. And the third reason we wrote this report is to change hearts and minds. We take pride in authoring white papers that don't sit on virtual shelves, never to be used again. We hope this report will open the eyes of voters and activists like the people in this room, lawmakers, and the media, and it can be a starting point for a conversation on why we must allow independents to vote in all taxpayer-funded elections and how we can do it.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Jeremy, what were your takeaways from the lens of working towards primary reform?
Well, thanks for the question, and a pleasure to be with you this evening. I see a bunch of familiar faces, some of whom I haven't seen for a while. Hi, Carmen. So I'm excited to be with you tonight. It's a great question. You know, it's funny. I'm an election attorney. I'm also an independent voter. And, you know, when I joined Open Primaries, I thought those two things prepared me to understand how the system worked. And I soon came to realize that they didn't prepare me at all. And if they didn't prepare me, an election professional, then I imagine most Americans have no clue exactly how disenfranchised independent voters truly are. And we're going to be talking about closed primaries, and that's perhaps the most egregious example of how independents are treated by our political system, because voting is so essential to our democracy. But that's only one facet of how independents are treated in the overall political system of this country. And if you look at really all structures throughout, not just the electoral system, but the political system as a whole, you will find instance after instance where independent voters are marginalized. So let's look, for example, at election administration. We are the only Western democracy that has a partisan system of election administration. So what does that mean for independent voters? That means that in New Mexico and in most states around the country, if you're an independent voter, you're not only shut out of closed primaries, you're not allowed to participate in any aspect of election administration whatsoever. You can't be a poll worker, a poll watcher. You can't serve as an election judge. You can't serve on an election board. So all the aspects of our election administration are prevented, independents are prevented of. But it doesn't just stop there. Independents are discriminated against just on the basic voter registration card. If you look at any voter registration card, or if you register online, you'll see very prominently the places where you can register as a Republican and a Democrat, and independent is kind of always off to the side. In fact, most states won't even call independents independents. You know, libertarians in the state of New Mexico are 1% of the population. You know what the New Mexico Secretary of State calls libertarians? Libertarians. You know what they call, you know what the New Mexico Secretary of State calls independents? 1/4 of the population? Other. Because in New Mexico and states around the country, independents really are the other. In campaigns, candidates and campaigns rarely speak to or reach out to independent voters. They are hounded in all aspects of our election system, minimized, marginalized, and sometimes ignored altogether. And so I often talk about opening the primaries not as the problem, but as a symptom of the wider problem. And that is how independents are treated as second-class citizens in our country and in our political system. And open primaries, I think, are a really important step forward towards treating that problem. And I'm excited about all the progress that's happening in New Mexico and happy to discuss it more.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Tyler, can you please share a little bit about the overview of the report's findings, and talking about how what Jeremy just expressed with, the limitations that independents have, how could we use those findings in addressing these?
Well, three big findings from the report. One is that there's a large and importantly growing number of Americans who can't vote in primary elections. Number two, these independent voters have nuanced and diverse political beliefs. And third, they're really pissed off that they can't participate in taxpayer-funded primaries. And to Jeremy's point, when we talk them through all of the other facets of our democracy that they can't participate in, they get really upset. I think the biggest takeaway from Jeremy's comments and from our research is that independent voters are a key constituency for primary reform and for the advocacy of their own political rights. It's not the case that Republicans or Democrats are going to be crawling out of the woodworks to be advocating for the rights of independent voters. And so I think we need to make clear to independent voters what those rights are that they don't have, that Jeremy just eliminated, and then make it clear to them the tools that they have to advocate for changes. On the findings of the report, we found that 23.5 million Americans across 22 states cannot vote in state, congressional, and presidential primaries. And 326,000 of those voters are New Mexico voters. So real people who are real taxpayers, who are real citizens, who can vote in general elections, that can't vote in our primary elections that decide 85% of who goes to Congress and who represents them in state legislatures. Not only are there 23.5 million Americans, but this problem is getting worse and worse and worse for all sorts of reasons, most especially that the two parties are getting very unpopular. More and more people are registering as independent voters. And so this problem has got 20% worse in just the last decade. And third, on this point, independent voters are not created equally. Independent voters are overwhelmingly young, they're more likely to be veterans, and they lean Hispanic, especially in the American Southwest. And so this means that closed primaries are distorting who's represented in both Washington and Santa Fe. In New Mexico, for example, of 18 to 34-year-olds, 48% of New Mexico voters under the age of 34 are independent voters. And so what that means is that half of your population can't weigh in on the elections that are deciding who represents them. And so the piece about, independent voters can't vote actually distorts representation in who serves in office. The second big finding of our report was that independent voters have very diverse views. They're not a monolithic group. The research kind of punctures holes in the idea that independent voters are leaners, they're just classic partisans. 48% of independent voters say they've never been registered with a political party. We found that they are not going to be likely to trust the same party on all these different issues. We asked about 15 different public policy issues, and we said, who do you trust on these issues? And there were very few respondents who said, I trust the Republicans on everything, or I trust the Democrats on everything. And that's different than how Republican and Democratic voters are. And one New Mexico voter said, I'm with Bernie Sanders on economic and healthcare policies and the Republicans on illegal immigration. Well, I know plenty of independent voters who are the exact opposite. They're with the Republicans on economic and healthcare policies, and they're with Democrats on illegal immigration, right? And so it's really important to remember that these voters aren't all the same. And the third big finding is that independent voters in closed primary states absolutely hate the fact that they can't participate. We call these independents excluded independents, and 77% of them say it's completely unfair that they cannot participate in partisan primaries, and 87% of them support opening primaries to independent voters. Perhaps my favorite quote from the whole report, and we asked independent voters, why are you independent? What do you think about the media calling you leaners? Do you want to be able to vote in primaries? And a woman and a veteran from Pennsylvania, when asked, what does it make you think when you're told independent voters like you can't participate in primary elections? And she says, it makes me question how they can call the US a democracy.
That's very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing, Tyler. Unite America, aside from this report, also has a thesis called The Primary Problem. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how you see independent voters being excluded from primaries fitting in?
Sure, thanks, Philip. So we have to ask ourselves, where are most elected representatives at the state and federal level getting elected? And it's easy to say, oh, they get elected in November when 70% of us vote in general elections. But the reality is that 90% of seats in this country are safe for one part or the other. Part of that is due to gerrymandering, but largely it's due to the self-sorting the electorate. Liberals and Democrats tend to live in urban areas, and conservatives and Republicans tend to live in rural areas. As a result, those geographies have become safe for one party or the other. So that means the primary election is the one that matters most. In New Mexico, you have 3 congressional districts. This fall, only one of those is actually competitive, which means the only election that matters in 2 of your 3 congressional seats is the Democratic primary. And in those 2 Democratic primaries, there's only one candidate. And so because so many elections are being decided in primaries, candidates are beholden to their party basis and they're not beholden to all of their constituents. So that changes incentives for when they're in Congress. Polarization and political gamesmanship actually get rewarded by partisan voters, and problem solving and compromise have become dirty words. And so not only are these candidates incentivized to represent the wings of their party, they're not accountable to voters because there's so little political competition happening. If you don't like what your representative is doing in Santa Fe or Washington, you have very little recourse because there just isn't enough robust political competition to allow you to hold your leaders accountable. And so how do independent voters fit into this problem? Well, one, they're part of when they're not allowed to vote, that fact is contributing to misrepresentation in office of being able to represent all of your constituents' views. And number 2, independent voters aren't able to swing their votes in general elections like they used to be able to decide election outcomes. It used to be that there were lots of competitive elections in our system. The independent voters were a key constituency in deciding who is elected. But because we've lost general election competitiveness, all this competition is happening in the primaries and independents can't vote.
Thank you so much, Tyler. You touched a little bit on my next question, but I would love to hear from both you and Jeremy on this. What are the implications of the findings of the report on the status of independence as we prepare for the 2024 elections?
You take it first, Jeremy.
Sure. I mean, a couple things. And one thing I wanted to touch on, because Tyler's absolutely right. The elections that matter in this country are the primaries, period. As egregious as some of the figures that Tyler mentioned with regards to congressional races are, they're even worse if you go down ballot. So let's look at the state legislature in New Mexico, for example, right? You have 112 seats in the state legislature. Anyone want to venture to guess how many were competitive in the last Senate and House round? Anyone? 14. 14 seats out of 112 were competitive. Almost half were either uncontested or 30% plus blowouts. So all the action is happening in the primary. And what people don't realize, and you probably do realize this in New Mexico, but as a national issue, what most people don't appreciate is that, we talk about the Republican and Democratic parties like these are competitive institutions in every state, but that's just not the case. Most states are one-party states, and the second largest group beyond that party, independents, right? So you usually have a dominant party and independents. And in many states now, a growing number, 8 states, independents are now the largest group of voters in the country. So despite all the challenges that I mentioned before, despite all of that, largest group of voters in the country, fastest group of voters in the country. And that's having all kinds of implications for this system. This November, like the last 10 years, here's sort of the gross injustice of it all. Independents decide close elections. They decide every close election. In every state, they decide a close election. So let's look at presidential. Independents swung for Obama. They swung to Trump. They swung back to Biden. They swung for the Democrats in the midterms, or in most cases, although not all. Independents are the decision makers in every race in November, and they will be for the foreseeable future. So here's what's going to happen. Independents in this country were shut out of so many primaries that are still going on, right? Some of the primaries were going all the way through August. But watch what happens in about October. We're going to start to hear even more about independents, right? Because everybody ignores independents until the run up to the general election. And then what happens? Well, they know for a fact they decide elections. So all the rollout is, where are independents going to vote? How are independents going to vote? Today, the New York Times just ran an article a week ago, based upon Pew Research, which looks at voters and asks them a question. They say, how do you affiliate? And if you say Democrat, they say, great. And if you say Republican, they go, all right. And if you say independent, they say, well, we got a few more questions for you. And then they start asking you questions. What is it? Where do you lean? Where do you tend to vote more? And when you answer those questions in a two-party race, you're going to answer one or the other. Then everybody gets refiled. And then the New York Times runs an article a week ago talking about how Republicans are gaining on Democrats in terms of national registration, ignoring the half of the country that is the largest and fastest growing group of voters. That's the reality of independent voters right now in America. And the reality moving up to November, all of a sudden, are the arms of the parties and the pundits open. Everyone wants to talk to independents. And then look at mid-November, it all goes away again. Open primaries is what I'm excited about in New Mexico, is that open primaries ensures that the conversations with independents continue after November, and they consistently continue after November. And that's something that's going to be really important as independent voters, like Tyler said. Our young people are over 50% independent. The state of New Mexico, as in every other state, will continue to increase in independent voter registration. We need to bring them into the system, and I'm excited that New Mexico is moving towards that with all the great work of New Mexico Open Elections.
I want to build on what Jeremy said and talk a little bit more on the demographics, which he was hinting at. And I think one thing I think most political scientists and researchers get wrong about primaries is they tend to compare Republican primary voters to Republican voters who participate in the general election and Democratic primary voters that vote in the general election. They compare them and like, oh, what do they believe? And are they like different along demographic lines? And they do find that they're different, but not by a lot. But what we really have to compare are Democratic primary voters different than all voters in Democratic areas, and are Republican primary voters in Republican areas different than all voters. And Louisiana is a great example. Louisiana's got an effort underway to try to close their primaries. 98% of the state's Black voters are registered as Democrats or independents. And so if they close primaries in Louisiana, where Republican primaries are the key election, then 98% of Black voters in that state won't be able to participate in the elections that matter most. In New Mexico, we were talking about how there's so many more Latino voters who are independents compared to other partisan affiliations. And so when primaries are closed to Hispanics in New Mexico, then those voices are inherently underrepresented. In, democratic safe areas, it's the democratic demographic that decides who goes and represents that place in, Santa Fe or in Washington. And so in those districts, older voters are likely to be unrepresented by who goes to Washington. The same is true of Republican areas. Republican areas tend to have older voters, so younger voters are underrepresented. Republican areas tend to be more white. And so as a result, Republican areas do a poor job of representing people of color in this country. And so I think just building on what Jeremy said on like they have different political beliefs and they're trying to corner one way or the other. They also are different demographically, and it has major consequences for representation.
One thing to add that I find I wouldn't have thought of this until I saw the research on it, and that is that closed primaries aren't just about primaries. So if you look increasingly at the research, what it shows is that voting is a cultural thing, right? You vote in one election, you tend to vote in every election. It's a muscle, and so when you have closed primaries and you're shutting out large groups of voters in the primaries, that doesn't just affect voter participation in the primaries. It affects voter participation in the general election, particularly among disenfranchised groups like Latino and African American voters who are already facing all kinds of obstacles in terms of voting, and so it has a domino effect. It affects voting throughout the entire aspect of the franchise, from the primaries all the way through the general election.
Thank you both for sharing your thoughts on this. I know that those who work in this field of trying to open the primary system, we continuously hear about presumptions regarding independent voters, right? Like, which way do they lean? What do they look like? Are they really real people, or are they just closeted Democrats or Republicans? And the list goes on and on about what we hear regarding independent voters. Jeremy, can you tell us a little bit about the Let Us Vote campaign and what you're doing to organize independent voters nationally and state-based?
Sure, but just as a quick thought on what you just described, very aptly, Scylla, and that is that you're absolutely right. People are always raising questions about who independents are, and to try to delegitimize them. Never in the same way with party voters, right? We never ask a Democrat why they vote or what motivated them for voting. Same thing with a Republican. We don't ask those questions. Independents are held to some different test as to whether their voting merits their inclusion in the system, as if that should be a barometer of whether, as an American, they should be allowed to vote in a publicly funded, taxpayer-endorsed election. We just believe that's just an absolutely false choice. The Let Us Vote campaign is a campaign that Open Primaries launched with the generous support of Unite America, and it is geared towards two distinct goals. One is to spread the word about who independent voters are. That's why the videos at the beginning of this call were from our campaign. It's all about showing people who are independents. Who are they? Well, they're really just voters like all of us, with the same inconsistencies and the same differences of opinion, and the same diversity as any other American voter. And they just want the chance to vote in a taxpayer-funded election, period. And so Let Us Vote is about showing people who independent voters are. But it's something more than that. It's about organizing independent voters. Because you have to ask yourself, how can it be that the independent voters are the largest group of voters in the country, and yet they're so marginalized? Well, I like to think of it sort of like the old martial arts movies you used to watch, when Bruce Lee would take on 100 people, right? They never fought them all at once. They always came one at a time. How do you take on 100 people? Well, when you come one at a time, you can deal with them. If they all jumped them at once, it would be over, right? Well, that's really what it's all about. Independent voters are all isolated voters. There's a lot of them. They rarely even know who the other independent voters are. They are not part of a community. There is no infrastructure like the parties have developed for party members to give them support, to build community, to give them the opportunity to stand up for their own rights, to speak their mind, to participate politically. And Let Us Vote has the grand ambition to be all of that, to give independent voters the opportunity to find community, to build relationships, and to engage in political activity that shows that there is power in numbers. Independent voters are the largest group of voters in the country. I can't say that enough. And they are one of the most discriminated against voters in the country throughout the system. And Let Us Vote is an opportunity to bring them together in common cause to change all of that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Can you share a little bit about which states you have filmed in and what
Yeah,
has
and
been coming out from these videos?
well, I mean, I got to start with New Mexico because Scylla literally just finished this afternoon filming in New Mexico. So stay tuned. Maybe we can all come back on a future call and we can do a bit of a show and tell and do some show some of the great film that I know she caught in New Mexico. We've been in Nevada. We have been in Pennsylvania. We are going to be in South Dakota in 2 weeks. We're going to be in Arizona in early June. And we're looking to continue as the campaign develops to go all around the country talking to independent voters from all walks of life, from all aspects of our great country, to just talk about why they're independent and how they view the world and why it matters that our democracy keeps them as second-class citizens and why that needs to change.
And I would love to highlight how drastically different every person's answer to these questions are, because like Tyler was saying, like Jeremy speaking about it, there's not one way or another that this massive population of voters lean. Everyone is an independent for a different reason, and they all have different policy beliefs. So when we are talking to our legislators about the importance of enfranchising independent voters, especially in the state of New Mexico, their number one question is, oh, well, are they gonna, support my policies? Are they going to lean X, Y, or Z way? And the hardest part is that I can't answer that question for our elected officials, and they need to know to trust the voters and to understand that access to voting in the primaries is the most democratic thing that we could do as a country. Allowing people to vote is what democracy is, and just continuing to refocus the conversation on that rather than, oh yeah, they'll totally support XYZ policies, right? It's about democracy and letting people vote.
Well, to your point, every time the franchise in this country has been expanded, all the way from post-revolutionary times when we started with just the landed white gentry, all the way to today, every time the franchise has been expanded, you have seen the same question come up. How can we trust that these folks are going to vote in a way that's appropriate, in a way, right? During I mean, you read some of the debates during the women's suffrage movement. They used to claim that women shouldn't be allowed to vote because they were just going to vote for whoever their husband told them to vote for. I mean, the mythology that has crept up around every group of new voters trying to be brought into the system is stark. But it all comes down to a very simple proposition, that our country and our democracy does not work until all voters can vote, period. That is the only way that we will have truly representative government in this country. And it's the only way, to Tyler's point or earlier about the obstructionism and the partisanship, it's the only way that we're going to overcome it is when we are in a position that our elected leaders are listening to and responding to the entire electorate and not just a handful of partisans over here and a handful of partisans over there. When they're listening to all of us, they are going to act in our best interest, or they're at least more likely to. And that's the goal of open primaries in the first place.
And so, Jeremy and Tyler, is there a way that allowing independence would help the major parties in any way?
I think so. And I think it's very justified to be really frustrated with the two major parties right now. And in fact, the two major parties have approval ratings lower than really any time in American history. But I'm also sympathetic to the argument that we need strong, healthy parties in our political system. Parties represent voters' beliefs, voters or primary or parties help, develop national policy agendas. Parties help put forward and screen candidates. And so it's important for reformers to say, oh, if I was a party, how should I be thinking about this? And I think three things I would say is one, if you allow independents to vote in your primary and that independent voter votes for your candidate, they're probably more likely to vote for your candidate in the general election. And in fact, there are 6 states where the state parties have made a decision to allow independent voters to vote in their primary. And I think that's one good, valid reason for parties to allow independent voters to vote in their primary. Number 2 is you'll be more likely to win in November and in general elections because you would have elected a more representative candidate. And if you make your primary electorate look more like your general election electorate, you're going to get a party nominee who's more representative of all the voters in the district, and that's going to make that candidate more likely to win in November. And third is that if you become a party that champions the rights of independent voters, that over the long run, the independent voters are going to reward you for that behavior. In our poll, we found that 58% of excluded independents said they would be more likely to vote for a party if that party supported allowing them to participate in partisan primaries. And it's not just parties. 62% of voters, nearly 2/3 of voters, said they would be more likely to vote for a candidate if that candidate supported allowing all voters to vote in all taxpayer-funded elections. And so I don't think we should be thinking about this as either for parties or against parties. It's like for voters, and what's good for parties can also be good for voters.
Yeah, I mean, I echo everything Tyler said. I would add, I've done a lot of work testifying around the country, and one of the states I spend a lot of time in is Pennsylvania, which we might want to talk about in a minute. And two of the folks that I regularly testify with are folks, two fellows by the name of TJ Rooney and Alan Novak. They are the former chairs of the Democratic and Republican Party in the state of Pennsylvania. Everything I think about how parties should think about independent voters, I learned from TJ and from Alan. And I put an article in the chat. You can read in their own words how they think about the party's relationship to independent voters. But here's just the fact. The fact is that over the last 10 years, party membership has declined precipitously. Period. It's just a fact. Demographics in this country are changing rapidly. More and more voters, like we both said, are not joining a party. Millennials, Gen Z voters, well over half don't want to join a party. The reality is that independent voters are already the largest and second largest group of voters in almost every state. So if you're a party, don't you want to relate to, build a relationship with, form a coalition with the largest group of voters or second largest group of voters in your state? Don't you think that might be perhaps advantageous to your electoral future? Well, TJ and Alan certainly do, and that's why they've been working on that issue and pushing that so hard in Pennsylvania. The parties are diminishing, and that doesn't mean they can't be revitalized. Parties go through, all kinds of ups and downs historically in this country. The real opportunity right now for both the Republican and Democratic Party is to build relationships with independents, bring them into a relationship through open primaries that doesn't force them to join a party or get lost, but says, I respect you with who you are. You're an American, you're a voter, I respect that. I think you should vote with my party, and I'm going to do everything I can to develop a relationship with you and tell you why that should be. And open primaries absolutely supports that position, and that's the future of the parties. And the first party that realizes that and capitalizes on it is the party that's going to succeed for a generation to come.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. Before we get into the next question, I would love to Acknowledge someone in the audience today. We have New Mexico State Representative Alan Martinez joining. Thank you so much for joining us, Representative. So what are some solutions to these problems, and which states could give New Mexico hope about opening our primaries?
Well, I think I'll
Maybe
jump. Oh, did you want to go first, Tyler? I'm sorry.
you go ahead, Jeremy.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to bring up Maine. And the reason why I wanted to bring up Maine is because we passed open primaries in Maine through the legislature in 2022. Why does that matter? Well, before Maine passed open primaries through the legislature, open primaries had not been passed through any legislature for decades. In fact, it was accepted belief that open primaries could only be passed through a ballot initiative process, which in this country is a somewhat limited process. Many states, including New Mexico, don't have ballot initiatives. We thought that was worth a change and worth a try. And so we worked for a number of years, and we were the only national organization to try it in Maine because, again, no one thought it was possible to do it through a legislature. Well, we did it in a legislature that is, relatively bipartisan in makeup. And we were able to successfully pass open primaries. Maine is a case in point. You can pass open primaries through the legislature. It is possible. And Maine is a particularly, I think, interesting example because there's a lot of similarities between Maine and New Mexico. Part of the reason why the push for open primaries started to really ramp up in Maine is because Maine, like New Mexico, passed automatic voter registration. Well, let me tell you about, I call it the Trojan horse of automatic voter registration. Most people register independent. And I don't think most legislators who pass automatic voter registration around this country fully realize that. But you look at states like Oregon, one of the early adopters of automatic voter registration. Independents were the second largest group of voters in Oregon at the time. They're now the largest group of voters in the state. It doesn't create independent voters, but it certainly accelerates the growth of independent voters. And that's certainly likely to happen in New Mexico. It's happened in every other state that's adopted AVR. And so Maine is a great example of a state that took advantage of having just passed AVR, appreciating what that meant for the changing demographics of the state, and passing open primaries through the legislature. And that's why I think we're so excited to see that possibility in New Mexico and Pennsylvania as well. I mentioned Pennsylvania earlier. They are also working to pass open primaries through the legislature. They've already passed it through the Senate. And so we're starting to see legislatures embrace open primaries as a legitimate issue for debate and discussion.
In addition to Maine, at Colorado, which is where I live and is a neighboring state to New Mexico. Unlike Maine, open primaries in Colorado passed via ballot initiative. We're one of the 24 states that are lucky to have such a process. And it passed with 64% of the vote in 2016. It's very popular among voters. We found this in our poll, and every time we talk to independent voters, whether it's in a research environment or a man on the street interviews, independent voters and actually all voters support the policy principle that all voters should be able to vote in all taxpayer-funded elections. And what was the impact in Colorado? Between 2018 and 2022, independent voters cast more than 1.1 million ballots in this state. And I think that's like really important to say because it's not just about some percentage of voters who get to participate or some increase in turnout from X% to Y%, but it is literally 1.1 million times somebody went to a polling location or they took out their mail ballot and they returned it that wouldn't have happened if the law hadn't changed. And so when I think about impact, yes, turnout has increased by about 10% in our primary elections because of this change. But when I think about the ultimate impact, I think about all those ballots that were cast that wouldn't have otherwise been able to happen. And it's really changed the political tone in this state. Republican and Democratic parties are competing for independent voters to participate in their primaries. In 2018, a vast majority of independent voters participated in Democratic primaries, and in the last two elections, been more likely to vote in Republican primaries. So there's a really healthy competition between the two parties to actually try to get independent voters to vote in their primary. And then I just want to really underscore what Jeremy said and maybe click down a little bit more in detail. Automatic voter registration is a policy that New Mexico and now more than 20 different states have adopted, such that when you interact with a government agency, especially the Department of Motor Vehicles, there's now a policy in place to automatically register those people as voters unless you opt out. Right, so the default is go from opt out to opt in to opt out. And in a lot of states, what's happening is you interact with the agency and then you're getting mailed a postcard, and you have to then return that postcard if you want to register as a Democrat or a Republican. A lot of people are like, well, I just not going to return the postcard, or I register as an independent. And so there's like this little flaw that's happening, which is like we're registering a lot more people, but most of those people are registering as independents, and then they can't participate in the primary elections that decide the vast majority of our elections. And so I think the New Mexico case is so related to the Colorado case because where we are geographically, we have similar demographics, our voters are feeling similarly about primary systems. So I think there's a lot to be learned from Colorado.
You know, I'll tell you my favorite thing about Colorado by far, and I talk about this all the time, is that there's a belief, there's lots of different forms of open primaries, and there's the belief that, that you can kind of plug and play by some people, that one kind of primary, open primary is better than another kind of open primary. One gets this result and one gets that result. And that's just not how politics works. And I think the Colorado example is such a powerful one because it's an expression of just how powerful any form of open primary can be when it impacts the culture all the ways that Tyler gave expression to, not just on its own, but in conjunction with other types of reforms and changes that have gone on in Colorado and that states like New Mexico have also adopted and are looking to adopt. This type of culture change is dramatic in Colorado, and it's dramatic by a very simple form of open primary, the same form that New Mexico is looking to adopt. And that's what gets me so excited, is that anything can happen with an open primary, and the change can be really significant, regardless of the form. And that's one of the things that I think is a real opportunity as we look around the country for, and not just in New Mexico, but around the country, for different ways to impact in different climates and different political situations, that open primaries at all levels can be a significant contributor to democracy reform.
Yes, they can. Thank you both so much for again joining us this evening. We're about at the time to turn it over to the audience for some Q&A. I know we've gathered some good questions in the chat already. And so for those who would like to ask live questions, please, you can unmute yourself or use the hand raise button, and we'll call on you. But in the meantime, Perry, do we have any questions in the chat that we could address?
We've had a few questions, but we've also had some answers from our helpful folks in the chat. One thing that was brought up is this idea that it's worthwhile to have independent voter registration for people working in government. And they're, kind of helping avoid conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest. We've also seen conversations about how do independent voters change their registration so they can participate.
Yeah, I maybe speak to the party registration one because it's something we were talking about in Pennsylvania just a few days ago. And this is really important. In most states, partisan registration is public. People can see how you registered to vote. And so there are people in certain industries, especially in government, who don't want people to know are they registered with Republicans or Democrats. And so the mere fact that your party registration is disclosed publicly, which is the case in the majority of our states, is inherently disenfranchising voters because they have to choose between registering with a party and being able to vote in a primary election. And that's just not right.
Barbara, please feel free to just unmute and ask your question.
I've never been in a Zoom where I couldn't find the
Hmm.
hand. I don't know where the hand is. See it in here. I had a question about our state where you said Republican, Democrat, or you just have to say other. Well, when I moved here 12 years ago and I registered as DTS, declined to state.
Mhm.
So I think that is what you would consider here, you're calling independence, would decline to state is what it is on my registration. And the other thing was, I wasn't sure when you were saying you couldn't participate because I have worked at the polls and I'm actually going to be working at the primary as a floor judge. I'm going to my training. And so I didn't know when you said you couldn't participate if you meant to be like some elected official or something, but you can
No,
work at the polls.
yeah, no, if you look at the statutes in New Mexico specifically, or now in some states, and in fact, many states outright bar independents from participating in many of the jobs you just described, Barbara. But New Mexico stacks the deck. So in New Mexico, by statute, independents can participate, but there's quotas. So there are specific numbers of Republicans and Democrats, for example, that are required in order to fill out an election board. And oftentimes independents are completely shut out as a result of those requirements. Similarly, with a lot of other aspects of jobs. So New Mexico isn't quite as bad as some other states that outright bar them, but they do stack the deck in a number of positions, and that makes it hard for independents to participate. And it's also, this is quite a problem in New Mexico, but it is a national problem. When you have a partisan system of election administration, so when you have the the competitors who are also the rule makers in the election system, well, that works when the parties are at parity. But the parties aren't at parity anymore, right? We have states where one party dominates, and the second largest group of voters are independents, and they're not allowed to participate. So that's where a lot of the election integrity issues that we're dealing with as a country come out of. They come out of an election system that is designed around the idea that the parties are checks against each other. And then we have, as Tyler was saying earlier, because of self-sorting, because of all kinds of other reasons, you have mostly one-party states and an election system that wasn't designed for one-party states. And a lot of the election integrity breakdowns that we're seeing is a result of that fact.
Yeah, the other thing too, it did come out in the chat after a while, but some people think you can't vote in the primaries. But in 2022, like I say, I registered DTS as a voter on my registration card, but I wanted to vote in the primary in 2022. So all I had to do when I went into the voting place and was even early voting, I just said I want to temporarily change to, and I wanted to vote in the Republican primary to a Republican. I was able to vote in the primary. And yes, it was a little bit of, I had to take the responsibility after the election was over. I had to go back to my registration and change it back to DTS. I mean, it is an extra step, but a lot of people don't understand that they can. I think that's important to try to get that word out in our state. Right now it's like you guys can go and vote in these primaries. Just go and say whichever one temporarily and change it.
Well, I would push back a little on that. You're right, people can. But imagine telling a Democrat that they just had to register a Republican and then register back to Democrat in order to vote in a primary, or vice versa. Imagine the uproar. Imagine the furor that we would have if Democrats and Republicans were told they just had to join the other party in order to participate in the primary, and they could, when they wanted to switch back. People, and we learned this from Unite's great report, independents have a lot of conviction in being independent. It means something to them. It's as much as being a Democrat means to being a Democrat and being a Republican means to being a Republican. Asking them to change that and to join another party in order to participate in a government election is something that more and more Americans are finding distasteful and un-American. And they shouldn't have to do that, right? In a country where we have publicly funded elections, and every American should be of equal value. And That's what open primaries is really all about, is about taking Americans where they are, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, independent, third party, it doesn't matter. In an open primary, it says we're going to treat you like an American and give you the right to vote, period, and put everybody at an equal playing field.
I agree. I agree that's ideal, but I'm just saying until we get to the ideal, there is something that's better than nothing, which we had before. Nothing, you couldn't at all, but thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I believe we have time for one last question from the audience. Sure, Bob?
Hey, Tyler and Jeremy, thank you both for being here. We appreciate it very much. Tyler, since you live in Colorado, can you share with us either anecdotal information or any research behind how those 1.2 million people changed the outcomes of any of the elections? Because that's what we're constantly asked is if independents play in primaries, will the outcomes be more conservative, more liberal, more centrist? What's your take on that?
I think it's a good question. I think it's a really hard question to answer because there's a lot of factors that go into it. First of all, simply by changing to an open primary system, you might get Democrats and Republicans to unregister. And one of the craziest things we found in our research was the states with closed primaries actually have the least amount of independent voters. And our hypothesis is that people are smart and they're like, well, I want to be able to vote. So they register with the party and then they're not independents. And so we have this like new species of dino and rhino. You may have heard Democrats in name only and Republicans in name only. And we have a species of these people who would rather be independent voters, but just simply because of the closed primary system, they're registered as independent or they're not registered as independent voters. And then you have to think about how many times did the open primary bring new voters into the political process who otherwise would have said, I'm just not going to register. And it's also really hard to assess this out in polling and did the number of independent voters switch this election to that election. And I think it's so hard to pin down. Was it a more moderate or more extreme candidate who won? Was it a more populist or more traditional candidate who won? And so I guess I don't have too much to say here other than maybe to end the whole conversation on a pretty macro and like really important point, which is the debate about whether independent voters should be able to vote in primary elections and participate in our democracy is not inherently a debate about like, will it help one party over the other? It is a debate about the rights of voters. And so once we start thinking about, is it going to help one party or the other, then we're just thinking about the problem on the wrong playing field.
Yeah, and I would add one more point, and that is 38 states have open primaries. 38 states. New Mexico is a tiny minority of states with closed primaries. And in 38 states, they've managed to not only have open primaries, but maintain them without problems, without really any significant change in party makeup as a result. Open primaries don't make states more red or more blue. They just let more voters vote. And that's really what it's all about.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to both Tyler and Jeremy for joining us this evening, and for everyone who was engaging in the chat and in our Q&A section. We really appreciate your time and investment in learning more about independent voters and how we can be a better representative democracy in our state, but in our country as well. Please stay tuned. Our next session will be next month, and we're going to bring some of the people that we interviewed for Let Us Vote. You're going to have an opportunity to meet New Mexican independent voters and talk about their experiences, their hands-on, direct, personal experiences being independents in a closed primary state. So once again, thank you all for joining. We will share the recording later with everyone, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening.
Thanks, everybody.